Hello, this is Tara Warwick, and I'm very excited to have you guys all here today. I'm excited to learn from Michelle. We just kind of an update on all the related services. We had a very successful 2-day intro course to related services. We had about close to 50 people who participated, so it was really exciting. We have Michelle talking about dyslexia this month. Next month, we're going to talk about goal writing and strength-based, about goal writing and strength-based approach. So that will be another one to look for. If you don't know how to find the old recordings, they're all on our YouTube channel. So if anybody needs that, let me know and I can put it in the chat. I'll probably go ahead and do that anyway when Michelle starts talking. So you guys know how to access all of the trainings that we've already done. So without further ado, I'm going to move it over to Michelle. And Michelle is from the State Department of Education. She's new to the State Department of Education, but very well experienced in special education. And so I'm going to let her get started. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box, and I will be monitoring the chat box, and then I will send those questions to Michelle. So if you have any during the training, just put them there, and then I'll either have her stop immediately or see if we can, we'll have time at the end of the training too. So Michelle, it is all you now.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I have been in the field of special education for about 26 years now. That makes me feel kind of old. And I've been a speech pathologist all of those years. I'm also a certified school psychometrist. And I've really just enjoyed hanging out with kids with all kinds of special needs and their teachers and their parents. And so I did move to the State Department this summer, and my areas that I cover are related services, evaluation and eligibility, and our dyslexic area. And I'm certainly by no means expert, but I'm going to throw some things out. This is really meant for related service providers. It's not training geared for teachers or very, very specific interventions, although we are having some workshops all over our state coming up, and Tara's going to send you out the link for that if you want to share that with teachers or if you want to attend one of those. Actually, they're all full except for our Tulsa location, which is November 14th and 15th. It's just a one-day conference. You can register for any day, but we'll get that link up to you a little bit later. So there is my contact. I'll have contact information for you at the end too, with my email and phone number if you want to write that down. So dyslexia can affect each person that we know a little bit differently. It's kind of like the saying that you hear about autism. If you meet one person with autism, then you've met one person with autism. Much of that could also be said for individuals with dyslexia. It just looks differently for each individual that struggles with it, although there are a lot of components that are very similar. I loved this quote by the author of the Percy Jackson series. He says, dyslexic kids are creative, outside the box thinkers. They have to be because they don't see or solve problems the way some other kids. And unfortunately, sometimes they're written off as lazy, unmotivated, rude, or even stupid, and they aren't. Often you'll find that kids that have or are identified with dyslexia, their IQ or their cognitive abilities are often very well within the normal average range, if not higher. And so it is very important to remember that this is not an issue of cognitive ability. Dyslexia falls in the category of a specific learning disability. It is a reading disability, and so when we test for that, we test as though we are testing for other specific learning disabilities. In Oklahoma, we do recognize dyslexia as a specific learning disability, and we test for that. Although I continue to hear teachers and administrators, principals, tell parents on a very regular basis, we don't do dyslexia here in Oklahoma. Well, we do. And so we are working really, really hard to kind of squelch that myth about Oklahoma, because we test. So according to federal regulations, dyslexia is a specific learning disability. It is a disorder of one of the more basic philosophical processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that manifest in the ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do some mathematical calculations. And again, dyslexia falls into the category of a specific learning disability in reading. Generally, it's identified either in reading comprehension or reading fluency. So we know that dyslexia is a language-based learning disability that makes it difficult to read, write, and or spell. So for example, you may hear kids say or write lawnmower instead of lawnmower. They may get those initial sounds or any sounds in the words confused, both in speech sometimes, in their reading and in their writing. Dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. It does not arise from a physical limitation or a developmental disability. So young children may have trouble recognizing letters, matching letters to sounds, blending sounds, pronouncing words, correctly using new vocabulary words. One of the most frequent things that I hear, especially with young children, is they really struggle to learn to rhyme, and sequencing can be a big key sign, again, with early kiddos, young kiddos. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding. These difficulties typically result as a deficit of the phonological component of language, and it is often unexpected and not in relation to other cognitive abilities. Secondary consequences can include problems with reading comprehension, reduced reading experiences that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And one of the things that Sally Saywich says is that reading is a gateway skill. In other words, it's the ability to read is fundamental to and facilitates all academic learning. So when a child's reading development lags behind his or her classmates, that child is at a disadvantage not only in reading, but also in writing, math, and other content areas. So some of the early signs, warning signs that we look for are the student's oral language performance, such as difficulty with speech, as I mentioned earlier, trouble rhyming words. Oftentimes you'll see students, especially very young students, that are not interested in looking at the print when they're being read a book. And then once letters are introduced, the student may exhibit little interest in learning the letters and may demonstrate poor letter sound knowledge. So the International Dyslexia Association refers to dyslexia as a language-based learning disability, again, that does not arise from a physical limitation or developmental disability. Again, very important to remember that it is not a developmental disability. Children don't grow out of this. It's not improved by repeating a grade or just giving them a little bit more time. Some myths about dyslexia. Any child that reverses letters or numbers has dyslexia. It's a visual problem. They only see words backwards or letters reversed. That is not accurate. If you don't teach a child with dyslexia to read by age 9, it's too late. They'll never learn. That's a myth. Mirror writing is a common symptom of dyslexia. Smart people cannot have dyslexia or learning disability. Very inaccurate. It's inaccurate to say there's no way to diagnose dyslexia, or that diagnosis cannot happen until the 3rd grade. Dyslexia is not caused by a lack of phonics instruction. People with dyslexia cannot learn to read. That is a very common myth. Often that's just not true. Children with dyslexia will never learn to read well. It's best to teach them to compensate, and we certainly do teach some compensatory skills, but students can also learn to read well. Retaining a child will improve their academic struggles. Dyslexia can be cured or helped by special balancing exercises, fish oils, glasses with tinted lenses, vision exercises, inner ear medications, training primitive reflexes, eye occlusion. There are all kinds of weird things out there that people say will cure or fix dyslexia, and most of those things just are not true. When we look at the brain, obviously it's a very complicated thing. We know that for folks with dyslexia, and typically neurotypical developing folks, that information is shared across the hemispheres. There's probably parts of the brain that are responsible for bits of processing on both hemispheres. Specific locations are responsible for the task of reading, but those are interconnected with other parts of the brain that are other tasks. But you can see from this slide here that the quote typical brain really activates in more areas when under the MRI, when we're talking about reading, than an individual's brain with dyslexia. So they're definitely missing out on some of the same pieces of information from their brain. So cause, we know that there's a congenital factor and some developmental factors. We often see family members of kids with dyslexia that have had dyslexia or say they struggle with reading. Research has not yet explored all possible causes, but as I mentioned earlier, they do find neurological differences in the brain that are believed to be the root of dyslexia. And when you talk about families, you often see it affecting family members differently, even within the same core group of family members. Effects of dyslexia, like I mentioned earlier, it affects everybody a little bit differently. Most folks with dyslexia can become good readers, while others may read more slowly or inaccurately. Most common and persistent issues are those of spelling, but it's important to remember that it's not just an issue with written words, that this affects individuals with other parts of their life as well. Some people with dyslexia may have difficulty coming up with specific names or dates, especially when they're pressured by time. They may struggle remembering a list of sequence of spoken words, such as telephone numbers, following a conversation, following instructions, or expressing a point of view. But again, that has to do more with the sequencing of things. When we talk about dyslexia, it's pretty widespread. Most information says probably about 20% of our population shows symptoms of dyslexia, so possibly even 1 in 5 of our students have dyslexia or could fall on that continuum of abilities or disabilities. Again, when we talk about the signs of dyslexia, we all recognize that that students with dyslexia have um, difficulty in learning to read, write, spell, some more math, arithmetic skills. They may have difficulty following oral and written instructions. Again, that leads back to that sequencing. There's a lot of comorbid factors with dyslexia, and we'll talk more about those in a few minutes, but the cramped or illegible handwriting is often a big telltale sign as well. Difficulty staying on task and easily distracted. Again, ADHD is often a comorbid diagnosis with students with dyslexia. Again, not always, but sometimes. There are a lot of confusion in letter sequences. We hear a lot about the letters B as in ball and D as in dog. When you look at words like quiet and quite, those words have the same letters, they're just moved around. Same thing with was and saw, or the numbers such as 81 and 18. Delayed spoken language, again with our younger students, we may see some of that in students with dyslexia. Again, confusion about space, time, left and right, up and down, north and south, yesterday and tomorrow. Again, some of the sequencing and patterns of things. Often we see high levels of frustration. You know, if you're in the school setting, then you see kids that are struggling to read, and what are they given to do in the classroom? They get to practice reading. When they get home, they practice reading. They practice reading after school and in all their spare time. And when other kids are getting to do other things, they're getting pulled to practice reading. Something that's really, really hard for them. And so we see a lot of frustration in some of our students with dyslexia. Like I mentioned before, the difficulty retaining information, increased anxiety, either increased or reduced energy level, and then again, some immaturity. And again, keep in mind, these are factors that may affect some students with dyslexia, but maybe not all. Other things that are typically or sometimes associated with dyslexia, I already mentioned speech problems, the spatial disorientation, the sequencing, difficulty telling and judging time, poor personal organizational abilities, and some of that mixed laterally. Laterally, I can't say that word. But we know dyslexia isn't just about reading. There's a lot of things going on with individuals with dyslexia. It affects their writing. We talked about spatial and temporal organizations, memory difficulties, motor control, obviously reading, spelling, and listening, being able to filter out information. Well, I love this graphic because when you start looking at this, you think, goodness, what is not affected if you have a student with dyslexia. So what is the difference between a reading disability and dyslexia? Reading disabilities occur when a person has trouble with any part of the reading process, while dyslexia is pretty much limited to difficulty with phonics, phonological processing, spelling, written expression, and that rapid verbal response. Dyslexia is the most common reading disability, but not all reading disabilities are due to dyslexia. So I'm going to say some things here, but please keep in mind that this is...
You're staying with me now.
Buddy has their microphone on, and we're hearing you talk to your kiddos.
Sorry.
That's okay. Remember, dyslexia is diagnosed a little bit differently, and it's really a district decision, and certainly an IEP team or evaluation team decision as well. So many schools in Oklahoma are moving more to an RTI process or response to intervention process type. And so you may have, your school district may choose to track a student's progress with screening and then determine if they're benchmarking. Some students are going to benefit from this increased intervention, and they may not have a learning disability. They may not have dyslexia, but they need that increased instruction, systematic instruction structure. And so they may benefit from that and may not need further evaluation. So if those things work, then absolutely that's the best way to go. But to determine eligibility under the category of specific learning disability, generally what happens is that we take a cognitive score, basically the student's IQ score, and we measure that against the student's achievement in reading, writing, and math, usually on a norm reference test of achievement. The most common used are the WISC or Wechsler series in Oklahoma and the Woodcock-Johnson 4. And they both have cognitive and academic pieces or achievement pieces to them. And so we measure that. We use the cognitive piece to look at, or to basically get a baseline. Where's this kid? What level should we expect this kid to function at in each of those academic areas, reading, writing, and math? And then when we look at those achievement scores, are we seeing a huge gap or a statistical difference? For instance, if the student has an IQ of 95 and their reading comprehension scores dip down into the 70s, it's a pretty big statistical difference. And so we want to take a look. We would expect them to be able to perform in the average area with all of their academics. So if they're not, then that would indicate probably a specific learning disability in one of the areas that have been measured. So we've already talked about these things. Yes, individuals with dyslexia can read and be very successful. You can Google individuals with dyslexia that are successful. You're going to see Steven Spielberg and all kinds of folks. I can't even begin to list them all. And so those are good things to talk to your students about and to show your kids that they can be successful and overcome this disability with hard work. Assistive technology plays a huge part in how we can help students be successful. Again, there's so many things out there now that we can use, and we should expect technology to be used today. It should be the norm. There are so many things, whether you're looking at apps on a tablet, a Google extension, there are pens that you can read what has been written across a page and put it in your headphones. There's just word prediction technology, so many things. Books, Audible or books on tape, Bookshare, just so many things out there. So we need to really take advantage and look at what options we have that can help your students be successful in the classroom setting. I love this chart, and it's not very big, and I apologize for that, but I couldn't make it any bigger, but I did put the link down at the bottom of the slide of where I got this, but and I didn't go through and check and make sure all of these are actual current apps or extensions, but I just really like the way that this was laid out. And so if you're looking for activities or you're looking for specific things that can help with application of knowledge or memory, then this I thought was a really good chart, so I wanted to share that with you. I've had a lot of questions about English language learners and dyslexia. Yes, students that do not speak English as their first language can also be identified as dyslexic. We know because it's a neurological learning disability, it seems to occur about the same rate in English learners as it does among students that are not English learners. And so, but we often identify these students much later because we're often not sure, is this a disability, or is this something that because the student is learning English that they're a little bit delayed. We know that it's difficult to, English is a hard language to learn. whereas the languages Spanish and Italian have far less complicated correspondence between letters and sounds. So it can take students a long time to learn English because it is so complicated already. But if they come from a background of, for example, Spanish or Italian, we can really see some of these things popping up with these kids too that we may not have seen had they stayed with their own language. Again, I just briefly wanted to mention about secondary transition. When our students are turning 15, we need to address transition. Colleges and universities have special services offices, so we definitely want to send our kids out with good testing and a good IEP or 504 with accommodations that are appropriate for them. And so as we begin to plan for transition, we want to make sure that we're helping students develop good habits that are useful in getting assignments completed, things like that. We want to help enable our students to reach their college goals or their career goals. And so that is something that we need to take a look at. We want successful learners, confident individuals, folks that are effective contributors to our communities and responsible citizens. And so as we look for schools to work collaboratively with students, parents, and community, we want to have them enable them to place strategies for our students to help cope with this stage of their educational career as they begin their last year of middle school and definitely through high school and college and career. Students with dyslexia who choose to attend college must meet the same admission requirements as students without disabilities. And so again, they are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504. But again, we want to send them out with good accommodations that are working well for them. So it's definitely something that we want to discuss and help our students be prepared to talk about and help them understand what they can ask for in their classrooms as they move on throughout their educational career. So we're going to talk a little bit about dyslexia as a language-based reading disability. Oral language refers to the knowledge of skills that we use to produce and understand spoken language. They serve as the foundation for learning to read and to write. Oral language is composed of 5 main components: phonology, morphology, vocabulary or semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. And although children acquire most aspects of oral language during early childhood, their language learning lasts well into adolescence and adulthood. Children continue to add their vocabulary and to their repertoire of language usage in different contexts. So much of this latter language learning is influenced by a child's academic and literacy experiences. So when we talk about impairments, we talk about kids that are acquiring oral language with more difficulty. So students that may have problems in language development and demonstrate impairments in their use or understanding of spoken language. These students may have difficulties pronouncing words, acquiring vocabulary, learning grammar. And when these deficits are severe and unexpected, these students may be diagnosed as a student with a language impairment. Children with dyslexia most often have, I'm going to switch gears here. Children with dyslexia most often have problems, as I mentioned, with the phonological component of language, phonological awareness, knowing the sounds, phonological memory, memorizing speech sounds, production of the names of letters, phonological retrieval, just being able to recall those letters, names, and sounds with automaticity, and then phonological production, so actually being able to produce those sounds and words. Individuals with dyslexia may also exhibit problems in language that extend to vocabulary and grammar development. Research shows that inclusion of deficits in oral language beyond the phonological component may place children at a higher risk for dyslexia. Again, this work indicates that children with a family history of dyslexia are more likely to develop dyslexia themselves if they have preschool problems in vocabulary or syntax, in addition to difficulties in phonology. And that's a study by Mall, Lofts, Snowling, and there's actually several studies there, and I can give you the links for those too if that's something that you're interested in. But again, it points back to, again, another genetic component as a possible link for the cause of dyslexia. Oral language impairments also place children at risk for difficulties in reading comprehension. Because oral language is a foundation for written language, a limited vocabulary and problems with morphology and syntax can cause difficulties deriving meaning from written text. So children with a specific comprehension impairment often show to have a range of problems in oral language as well. So we talked earlier a little bit about dyslexia and possible comorbid conditions, dyscalculia or math disability. Students with autism can also have dyslexia as a comorbid condition. Visual is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Definitely language and communication. Processing delays, both auditorily and just cognitively as well. Some coordination issues, motor skills issues. We're going to talk a little bit about dyspraxia in a second. Students, like I mentioned earlier, that may be learning English as their second language. Students that have interrupted learning or starts and stops of learning. They may have other social and emotional issues. And then the high and low abilities, they may really excel and be really gifted in many areas and then really struggle in other areas. And so you'll hear about kids being twice gifted a lot of times when they have dyslexia. So we're talking a little bit about dysgraphia. It's not my area of expertise, but there are some important things that I wanted to bring up, especially considering that we're talking to related service providers today. We know that dysgraphia is a condition of impaired letter writing or disabled handwriting is what this author called it. We know that handwriting is a complex skill. It includes visual perception, neuromuscular, motor components. It's a pretty labor-intensive motor component or motor skill that not only includes holding the writing utensil, stabilizing the paper, visually guiding the hand, moving the writing utensils along with the paper, visual recall of the letter, memory of the letter formation, and then word formation and writing and rewriting as part of the editing process. All of these things make writing one of the most difficult and complex skills acquired by students. And one of the reasons that I think some of our kids struggle so much. So when we look at the physical act of writing, the disability related to that is known as dysgraphia. The causes of dysgraphia seem to be that it is an orthotic coding, more to do, or a lot to do with working memory, again, related to handwriting. Children with dysgraphia do not have, again, a primary developmental motor disorder or another physical cause of poor handwriting, but may have difficulty planning sequential finger movements such as touching the thumb and successive order on the same hand without that visual feedback. A similar chart to the one we looked at for dyslexia a few minutes ago, dysgraphia also, kids that struggle with organization, fine motor skills, concentration, classroom management. So you can see the overlap in dyslexia and dysgraphia and how some of those things affect both of these disabilities. And so that was one of the reasons that I want to discuss this a little bit further, is because we may be seeing kids that are struggling with one or more of these conditions, that we should be maybe looking at a bigger picture. So why is the diagnosis of dysgraphia and related learning disabilities important? Well, without diagnosis, children may not receive early intervention or specialized instruction. A lot of our schools right now don't have systematic instructional programs in handwriting and spelling. And so we may need to look at whether these students need explicit systematic instruction in handwriting or spelling or both, in addition to that word reading or decoding. So we've seen a lot of our handwriting programs fall away over the course of the past few years. And so again, this is just taking a look, are we missing something here? Often accommodations, we want to offer accommodations in testing and teaching students with dysgraphia because they're probably going to be moving a little bit slower. But again, we want to be providing ongoing explicit instruction in handwriting, spelling, and composition. Some activities that are may help improve handwriting of children with dysgraphia. Strengthening hand muscles, we played with clay, using mazes to develop motor control, connecting dots or dashes, tracing letters with something other than the pencil. You could use the eraser end or an index end. There's a lot of fun activities to do with kids with that. Using textured items, using the large muscle groups, writing air, letters, using your whole arm, using sand, shaving cream, soap, sensory boxes like rice, things along those lines. Draw the big letters on the sidewalk, encourage kids to walk and jump on them. Following teacher modeling. As kids get a little bit older, I think it's important to help learn the automatic letter writing when we get to that, and again to work on automaticity to help increase their speed and just the memory of the writing process for specific letters. Research shows that students with dyslexia do struggle with some physical coordination. From the research that I read, it does seem to be that the cerebellum is involved in reading, and so perhaps that is one of the reasons that coordination may be more difficult for kids with dyslexia. Again, it may be an issue of automation, and so it's something definitely that is being researched right now. Students with dyslexia may find barriers across the classroom setting, across the curriculum, and throughout our schools. And we often see kids that are discouraged and begin to struggle with their self-esteem issues and things like that. And so there are a lot of things that come up as a secondary condition to dyslexia, and that lack of self-confidence or self-image, fear of new situations, difficulty understanding written or verbal instructions, being disorganized, appearing to lack stamina. I kind of struggled with that one a little bit. I don't know that they actually lack stamina, but they may be using it in other areas of their education or other areas of curriculum. So you know, we often hear this kid's lazy, or this kid just won't do anything, or they're not motivated. And some of the motivations may be there, but they may also be using everything they've got in order to learn, excuse me, in other areas. And so that lack of stamina may be there for some tasks. And appearing to avoid some work. I don't like to do work that's hard for me, so I can completely understand this. Research has shown that some students with dyslexia have some postural instability, some poor balance. Again, this affects some students, not all students. So it's important to remember that. It's not across the board. Students may excel with sports and athletics. Others may not enjoy that quite so much. We know that students with dyslexia benefit from multisensory learning. And so a lot of times with motor things, we can incorporate that. Some other physical coordination support strategies. We want to introduce exercises that are going to help develop motor control and sensory information. We want to provide opportunities for students to practice sequencing opportunities and skills. Sometimes using games and fun, you know, improves response. We want to arrange activities that are going to help develop those binocular coordination using near and distant targets. Kind of one of the things that I wanted to point out is don't always use verbal instructions alone. We can combine those with demonstrations, other forms of instructions, and you may have to repeat instructions more than once. Highlighting using color codes is a great way to provide some support for students. Teach using mnemonics, rhymes, color coding, jingles. Again, visual representations and colors for developing strategies of play. Sequential checklist for sports preparation. If you're going to play this game, these are the things that you need to have out. These are the equipment that you need. These are the teammates that you need, those kind of things. Don't expect a student with dyslexia to be able to listen, write, perform all at the same time. Not that they can't do those tasks individually or begin to learn to work with those things together, but that may be a skill that's difficult for them. Also using large print versions of rules or anything that you would put in writing is more helpful. I would assume that one of the questions that we may want to talk about is the dyslexic font. And this kind of prompted me about that. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done on that. So just be aware that that's not an end-all be-all, and we can't control the font of everything outside of school. So we don't, the thought process among most folks right now that are pioneers in the dyslexic field is that we don't want to teach a student to read just one font because we can't control that that's the font that they're going to see for the rest of their life. And we want to teach generalization skills and things like that. So just be aware of that. Some accommodations, extra time on tasks, providing quiet areas to work, especially if there's going to be a timed component, giving the option to record lectures, giving the option to be able to give responses orally or verbally rather than in writing. Not having students reading orally in class unless they just really choose to do so. And possibly exempting them from foreign language learning. Again, that might be a district decision as the student gets older, as a graduation requirement. And I know many of our, that's what we generally a requirement. So there may be some other things that they can do instead of learning a foreign language. Unless they're really motivated to do that, I don't think that should be taken away from those students. Some other ways to support students with dyslexia. Remember that students need to feel like they excel in other areas. And while it may not be reading, it could be sports, it could be theater, science, art, debate. We want our students to experience success. And I think as related service providers, we're really good at seeking that out, finding what our students are good at, and helping that spill over into the classroom. I think it's important that we share stories of successful individuals. Again, as you see your students and know your students, and you guys spend some time looking at professionals and other careers that may be similar to what the student likes or enjoys, you'll find that individuals with dyslexia, adults with dyslexia are all over, and you can find professionals in pretty much every field that have dyslexia. Again, remember assistive technology, audiobooks, computers or tablets. There's some evidence that keyboarding may be affected for students with dyslexia, but some students may benefit from that. Using things like rulers and things like that to help keep the letters together in a line on the page. I've heard kids talk about the letters move around on the page. That's not true of every individual with dyslexia, but I've heard some kids talk about that and how it really bothers them, but sometimes even just a ruler can help with that. And then providing emotional support. You know, we have a lot of students that talk negatively about themselves, like I'm stupid, I just can't do it. So think about how we can combat that negative self-talk. Help students identify their strengths. Talk about the things that they do well, and help them learn through those processes as well. Praise the hard work. Help those students know when they're struggling with something that, hey, maybe that is because you have dyslexia. I've heard a lot of students in middle school and high school, especially recently, say, you know, once I knew that I had dyslexia, it helped me so much because I knew I wasn't stupid anymore. And so, you know, sometimes you have to call a spade and talk with the student about, you know, naming what is easy for them or what is more difficult for them, and talk about why, the reason that is. So here's my contact information, my email, that's my specific desk phone number, if I can help with anything. Unfortunately, in October, a lot of our dyslexia workshops around the state are in October, so I'm going to be in and out a lot this month. But I'm very excited about that because it does give me the opportunity to see folks in the field and talk about dyslexia and get services out and ready to go for our students. So if you ever need me, I answer emails pretty quickly, but I'm not in the office every single day to get to the phone, but I will return phone calls just as quickly as I can. Or like I said, emails are a great way to get in touch with me as well.
Michelle, we have a few questions.
Okay.
This was so helpful, and we're getting a lot of great feedback on it. Are you okay with me sending the handout to people?
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
So that will have all the visuals. We had questions on that. Yes. And there were several questions about diagnosing dyslexia. So somebody asked about, can an SLP diagnose dyslexia? And then someone else asked about tools to diagnose dyslexia.
Okay. So I'm going to default a little bit to ASHA about whether or not a speech pathologist can diagnose dyslexia. Absolutely, there are tests that we have and we are qualified to give that are going to determine that we're going to be able to see specific phonological disorders, definitely vocabulary issues, and things like that. And so I definitely agree that we can be a very big part of the diagnosis and the battery of tests that are given to help identify and make interventions for students with dyslexia. The part that I think is a little bit more gray is that as speech pathologists, we cannot give the cognitive and academic achievement parts of, for example, the Wechsler series, the WISC, or the Woodcock-Johnson. Those publishing companies have designated that only school psychologists or school psychometrists can give that. And so many of our districts in Oklahoma are still discrepancy districts in that they need to be able to see that gap between the cognitive score, the IQ score, and those academic scores. So where we're really going to see the reading disabilities come into play, especially in that reading fluency and reading comprehension areas. And so as speech pathologists, we cannot give those assessments at this time. So it really, I know that there are districts that are using speech evaluations and information from speech pathologists that are using pieces of that to help determine dyslexia, and there are some in our state, there are some speech pathologists that have received specialized training in, for example, as a reading specialist. And so, you know, they have their hands on some different tests. And so there are things that we can do to diagnose dyslexia. Whether or not the district accepts that, again, is a district decision.
Okay, great. Another question that we had, and I don't know, Michelle, if you can answer this or if anybody else can, but someone asked if we could address the reason that specific instruction in handwriting and spelling does not occur in Oklahoma schools. Video modeling of handwriting would be beneficial for consistency. So I don't know if you could address anything about the handwriting and spelling.
I can't, as a matter of, you know, as a State Department employee, this is the way things should be or the way things have to be. That is not mandated. Curriculum is not mandated by the State Department of Education. And so districts often choose that. I know, you know, for my own student, it was my own child, she went to 2 different elementary schools, and in one elementary they taught cursive, and the other one they had completely let that go. They didn't teach handwriting of any type. And so when she moved from the school that didn't address handwriting into the school that expected students to begin writing in cursive in 3rd grade, going into 4th grade, we really had to struggle and do a lot of cursive writing at home to make up for that. And she still refuses to write in cursive, and she's 13. So, so no, I probably should not answer that. I gave you a long-winded answer to say I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, that's a big one. So, all right, is there any other? Does anybody else have any questions? I put in the chat box where the recorded meetings are at. So we already have some there, and then I'm going to, as soon as we're finished with this, I will upload it by tomorrow to that YouTube. So there's one on trauma on there. There's the one on behavior from last month. And then also, Michelle, I found the link for the upcoming dyslexia conferences, and I put that link on the chat box too.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I will, I'll also send out an email to everybody with the recording and the PowerPoint. We have a couple more questions. She asked, where can I go to get training? That she would be considered knowledgeable enough in dyslexia. where would be, do you know where, I mean, would that be an ASHA thing for more specific dyslexia trainings for speech paths?
Yes, look through their policies and procedures, or because they require you to be a specialist in that area in order to provide therapy or services in that area, or to say you're a specialist in that area. So take a look at ASHA first, and then you can always send me an email. There are places in Oklahoma and online where you can take some kind of reading specialist type courses. I'm not sure how strongly I feel about those right now, but I would default to ASHA first.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. And everybody, reach out to Michelle if you have any questions. She's very helpful, very resourceful. And like I said, I will get this uploaded and you guys can share it with other people. Thank you guys, and you have a great week.
Thanks, Tara. Have a good day.
You too.